Hi, David Vizard here, and you guys are watching PowerTech 10. In this episode 162, I'm going to do a short story on bolts. Why? Because I've had lots of questions about bolts, whether their stock bolts are good enough, they can't afford ARP bolts, why you should use ARP bolts, etc. But basically, how to save money by knowing your bolt tech. So let's get on with the show. In case I haven't actually detailed it, let's go into the spec of engine we're going to use. This engine, we uncover it here. It's been wrapped up for the night. Basically, there's nothing much special about it. The short block assembly was built for me by my very good friend Jim Wright at Motorheads up north. I'll put the contact details under here. Now, it's nothing super trick. It's just got good parts in it. Mylar pistons and rings. It's balanced. Was a selected crank. It's got the powder metallurgy rods in, which are good to around about 7,500, maybe a bit more. To be honest, I've used them with good pistons on, something not too heavy on budget circle track motors up to 8,000. They lasted a season. That's racing almost every weekend. And what is more, they consistently finished up in the top 10-15% of the field. So you can do a lot with those rods. But anyway, the engine is going to be a test engine for cams and cylinder heads. The cylinder heads I've got on here at the moment are absolutely stock double hump castings. Look, somebody said, why didn't I put screw-in studs in? Short memory, forgot. But it's not a problem. These valve springs here, and I've mentioned these before, they're cheap, but they're very good. And why are they cheap? Because they make so many of them. I usually get my springs, these in particular, from Howard's Cams. Dirt cheap. I don't know what the opposite to dirt is, but great. Never broken one in, 40 years. I was introduced to these springs when I worked in Tucson at Denny Wyckoff's shop, but hey, it was Denny that put me onto these. But anyway, so it's a basic motor. Now, I have 3 cams I'm going to test in it. The lobe center lines should coincide with these heads, which have 194 valves, and some of the test heads we're going to put on, which have 202 valves. Also, we're going to test maybe 2 or 3 different sets of heads here, as well as modifying these to see how well they can be modified with some very simple mods that I'm working on here that can be done almost all on a seat and guide machine. Anyway, that's about it for the test engine. Rockers, I will start off with stock rockers, so we'll test some rockers to see how that does. And the intake manifold will be a 2-plane manifold to start with, and we might put a Victor Junior on just to see how that does. Let's start the ball rolling with stock head bolts. Now, I do have to make a kind of half-hearted apology here. I threw away all the bolts that would have been a good, how should I say, example of a thoroughly rusted bolt looking like it was just fit for the trash. But surprisingly, if you're building on a budget, you can, how shall I say, recondition those bolts so that they are usable for a stock but nice rebuild. Something that's not making more than about 340 horsepower, which will apply to a lot of you. I know some are going to say, well, we'd like to fit ARP bolts. I always like to fit ARP bolts. Why? Because as costly as they may seem, they are excellent for the job. They are some of the finest products for the money you'll find anywhere in the speed equipment market. I've been using bolts, ARP bolts now for over 35 years, and I am never having to criticize their quality. So instead of having a scrappy looking stock bolt, I've got this. Let's hold it up a bit closer there. Now, can you see that? Is it focusing? Not very well, but it's a stock bolt. It's one that came out of one of my Dyno mule motors, which was built for about a year. Spent only about 6 hours on the dyno all told, so it only saw water for about 6 hours. However, I'm going to have to use this as a model of how to treat a stock bolt before reusing it. And the stock bolt's reusability depends on how well you can recondition and polish the thread. I'm going to do this one so that you can see the effort that's put into it. Now, I've tested this, took a couple of polished bolts up to ARP many years ago, and within reason, a bolt that's moderately pitted and polished will actually clamp the head every bit as good as a brand new bolt. Let me polish this one up and show you what I mean. Got an interesting piece of paper here. This piece of paper is living proof that age does not do your memory one single favor. I usually figure out whether we've got a story or not on an engine dyno test by looking at the torque versus the cubic inches. If it doesn't make good torque per cube, then it's not worth a story. There's plenty of bad engines you can copy on the internet, but I'm not doing that. Now, here's what happened on this one. It's a 482-inch big block. Stock stroke, big overbore. We had a good block. Now, it made 622 foot-pounds of torque, which only works out to about, I say only, this is better than usual still, to 1.3 foot-pounds per cube. And I was thinking, well, my target's usually something closer to 1.4. Then I realized that this wasn't a 10.5 to 1 motor. It was a very low octane motor for a guy who was doing lots of towing, wanted to put cheap gas in it, etc., etc. Definitely an 87 octane special, maybe less. 621 foot-pounds from a 482 is, if you start checking through other people's power figures or torque numbers, pretty good. And that's with their engines at a higher compression. But then I quickly went down the horsepower numbers, and remember, it is a 482. 674 horsepower. It's a truck motor. And I thought, wait a minute. And I looked at it, and this was a test that Terry and I did ages ago, well over a year ago. Right, and I think with all of our medical problems, we kind of lost sight of it. But it's got the 280cc oval port trip flow heads on it, and I thought, that's well worth a story. I know there's going to be a lot of you want a low compression truck motor. No problem, nothing special deal that really works. Well, here it is. It's on the list to do as soon as possible. Anyway, here's the purpose of this. Let me take my glasses off here. Here's the purpose of this interruption to our regular programming here, in as much as sales. Now, the box is upside down from your point of view. because I'm going to open the lid in a minute. But this is a wind over port intake manifold, part number 7620. Let me tell you how I've got this one. It's brand new and in the box. Terry and I were doing a motor quite a while back now. This must be 4 years ago. And what happened was we planned it out, and I said what parts I'd get, and Terry would get the rest. Well, somehow or other, the intake manifold, or the duty of buying the intake manifold, got confused. I bought one, and Terry bought two. One to test stock with nothing else but port matching, and the other one to modify. Well, we used Terry's. I've had this one sitting on the shelf ever since. So let me show. It's brand new. Never been used. Right, let's pull it back a bit here so you can see into the box. Never been used. Oval port 4150 manifold. I'll put the Summit price going across the bottom, but we did this on Terry's Dyno, not this manifold, but this style, both stock and modified. It worked very well stock, especially for low end power. It liked the vacuum secondary for street use. The one I modified worked pretty well as a street strip manifold. Didn't have the huge top end horsepower that I had hoped for with our regular race manifold, but it was definitely better than normal. So look out for it. Anyway, back to our normal programming. What I have here is a polished bolt, and I've just slipped a freshly tapped nut on it. You can see it has absolute minimal thread friction. Now, here's our bolt. This is how your used bolts should go in. From what I learned whilst I was up at ARP, a polished thread like this compared with one that's just nominally clean is probably in the region, if I remember rightly, of about 300 pounds of clamping load. The worst enemy to a blown head gasket is friction at the thread. You must minimize it. Polishing a thread like this causes the torque to go into clamping force, not overcoming friction. So that's your first job if you're going to use old bolts. Secondly, polish under the head here so that when it slides down onto the washer, it's slipping and not causing friction there. Two golden rules. Don't ignore them, and you'll make your old bolts hold up much better than you might think. They're never going to be ARP bolts, right? They are physically just not strong enough to be ARP bolts. But ARP bolts, they give you the torque that they've got to be done to and things like this, and they really live up to it. So, and one last thing. Make sure your head bolts in the block are tapped with a brand new tap, and then the tops of the threads are countersunk so that the top thread is at least a turn down and it can't pull up and, I don't know, form a burr there, right? So that's that there. And the next thing will be making sure you lube it. Now, for most of you, that will be ARP bolt lube, right? I've got some here, I think, somewhere. Yeah, you'll know it. But because these heads are going to be on and off, a slight leak is not going to matter. But thread burnishing is. So I'm using this absolutely messy moly grease because these heads are only going to be on for the break-in and a few power pulls. That's it. I doubt that we'll have more than 2 hours time on them before they will come off and something else will go on. So moly grease if you're doing a quick head change, ARP lube, or thread sealant, as you know, like the stuff we use to make sure water doesn't leak out anywhere. Most of them will lube the bolt well enough to pass as bolt lube, and they'll also seal the thread. Now, what am I using on this motor here? An ARP bolt, right? It's all shiny, the threads are all smooth. You'll notice that it's an 8-point bolt, right? Why an 8-point bolt? They're cheaper. They're made of exactly the same steel as the, did I say 8-point? 6-point, can't count, old age. They're exactly the same material as the more expensive 12-point ones. There is very few occasions when you need to use a 12-point. On the other hand, if you're building your small block Chevy or doing a normal rebuild, performance rebuild, even a basic one, the 8-point ones, they're much cheaper. They will work just fine on the Ford or small block Chevy. Now, the other thing is, they will also torque down such that they hold the head down just the same as the 12-point. So don't go spending money you don't need to. There are a couple of occasions when the 12-point bolt is needed, and that's in between the center head bolt between the springs, because you can't get the wrench on if you've got big springs on there. But for most heads, that's not the question. You won't have springs that big. So here we go. That's the bolt. Now the first thing I'm going to start with is the washers. These are hardened ARP washers. You do not want to use regular washers. These are pretty hard. I mean, I think they're like 68 Rockwell or something like that. But they're also very smoothly finished. Grease these both sides with the moly grease. And the chamfer goes up, not down, so that the radius on the bolt doesn't interfere with the clamping that comes about. So there we go. Now let's just install them. First move, washer, moly grease, paste it on the washer, take the bolt, put the bolt in, remember, chamfer towards the head of the bolt, turn it round to spread the grease, and next move is to put on the bolt whatever it is needed. In my case, moly grease. For most of you, it will be the Permatex sealer, right? You can be pretty generous with it. It's not going to be something that is too much. So now I've got the grease on here. Next, stick it into the head. Now, just to save time, I use this setup to screw them down. Right, it's set on a low torque, so this is the ARP lube I was on about earlier. It's in the kit of bolts. After they're all installed, buzz them down with something like this, set on low torque. This one's about 5 foot-pounds. And this makes quick work of it. Right, that side done. Same on the other side. Okay, it's time to torque up the head bolts. Now let me ask you guys a question. How many of you forget the order in which they're supposed to be torqued up? If you don't build engines very often, and even if you do, it's something you probably forget, and get a piece of paperwork out to show you how that's done. I'm going to fix that for you. You will never have to remember the order in which to torque bolts down if you follow this rule. Now, why is it we have to torque them in order? Well, if you look very carefully, the order, if you join a lineup, starts off at one near the center. Right, we've got one right on center on a Chevy, and it works its way around in a circle like this, spiral, sorry, and it keeps on going until it goes right out to the edge. So what you do is you tighten up the next one in that spiral. Why? Because if the head is bowed, right, it flattens it out from the middle. So if there's any error in it, it will help compensate that error by bending the cylinder head very slightly. So there's no magic in the order it's tightened up. It's just got to go round in a spiral with each bolt. That's how it's done. Now, so that I can get it all in the picture here, I'm going to shoot this with the engine leaning over. Normally I'd have it upright, but not for this here. Can't get a good shot. Right, so here we go. Now, something I'd like to throw in here is I like to be a bit of a belts and braces guy. So I use the torque wrench set to the torque I want, plus one of these digital torque recording deals. Now, they used to be expensive, but they're not anymore. I think I got this one at Harbor Freight a few years ago for, I don't know, 25 bucks or something like that. Not much. Next one, 3. Next one, 4, 5, 'Now, before you've gone too far one way, I'm going to come back and spread them out this way. Remember, I'm tightening from the center out, or in that spiral I've just said. Well, I'm not going to go through the procedure of actually showing it because it would look exactly the same, but to finalize everything, we go through from the 30 odd foot-pounds to 50 to 65 and tighten everything down as per spec in the same order that we did to start with. Okay, that brings us to the end of this episode on our engine build here. Next I'm going to show you how to do the valve train, well actually more like the cam and lifters, etc. So look out for that. So other than that, let me wish you a good new year for 2025, because it's January when we're doing this video. And don't forget, subscribe, like. If you've got any super thanks, great, we need that. I've still got to acquire 30 grand. And share. Right, that's it for now.